uncomfortable position of doing some talking right after lunch. So you'll have to deal with that as well as the content of everything, but we'll make it happen. So this lecture is going to be on Hebrews, but not Hebrews in general, the very end of Hebrews, between chapter 12 and chapter 13, and basically how chapter 13 relates with the rest of the book. So we're going to do a little bit more academic stuff. We're going to do a little bit more of the classroom. We did some live, but now we're doing classroom. But basically the argument that I'm going to make here is that the author of Hebrews is a pastor, and chapter 13 is his pastoral word after his main oration, as we'll see. Chapter 13 is kind of a personal note at the end, added on to by himself a little bit later. So we're talking about the same things. So this is called the end of Hebrews, a pastor's heart in a writer's sermon. So the book of Hebrews has proved an enduring enigma throughout the reception history of it in the church. It defies easy categorization at every turn. Although the Eastern Church more readily accepted Pauline authorship in the West, it seems to be more of a recognition of its inspiration than any sort of stylistic similarity to the apostle. Audience and date and provenance of the letter also remain elusive. The difficulties of pinning something down in the historical context of this book has led someone like L.D. Hurst to state that Hebrews is, quote, something of a joke played upon a church obsessed with finding complete certainty about its origins. Structural divisions in chapters 12 and 13 are a perfect microcosm of these difficulties. Hebrews chapter 13 has been the subject of most heated debate since the advent of modern critical scholarship. William Rada, for instance, wrote of a pseudo-Pauline character to chapter 13, while more recently others are simply content to attribute it to a second author. Others, seeking to defend the integrity of the epistle, argue that a chapter needs to be taken as a natural conclusion to the letter because of similarity in theme and vocabulary. In his doctoral dissertation on Hebrews, George Guthrie graphs structural divisions of 8 eminent New Testament scholars, and each one of them have a very different understanding of the structure of Hebrews. However, in recent scholarship in the field of rhetorical analysis is yielding tantalizing clues to the structure of Hebrews. Rhetoric in the Roman world was extremely important among those with more than a basic education. Helmut Lohr has argued convincingly for the value of rhetorical categories in assessing the book of Hebrews, while people like Karen Jobes and Czeslaw Speak have both proven the rhetorical influence upon the author on a phrase and a sentence level. So we know that the author of Hebrews, at least on a small scale, on a word and sentence level, is affected by Greco-Roman rhetoric. However, there remains a need for a comprehensive assessment of the rhetorical handbooks of the period as applied to problem areas. So the quote is, "The state of research is such that no one has yet produced a structural analysis of the homily that conforms strictly to Greco-Roman handbooks. So the current study is a small step in that direction." The central argument of this study argues that the peroratio of Hebrews chapter 12, 18 through 29 completes the rhetorical structure of the sermon, leaving the purpose of chapter 13 as a structurally unrelated pastoral addendum written by the original author. So don't hear what I'm not saying. I don't think it's a different author. I don't think there's a pseudo-author. I think it's by the same author. It's just not part of that original oration. So if we can, let me just go ahead and read this so we got kind of a good understanding of it. And we'll start in chapter 12, verse 18. "For you have come not to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and a sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given, even if a beast should touch the mountain, it should be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned on earth, how much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken, that is, the things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. I'll just read a few verses of the next chapter. Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and to those who are mistreated, since you are also in the body. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Keep your life free from the love of money, and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. I'll stop there. So the examination today is the thought, what is a peroratio? What is the Greco-Roman, what do the Greco-Roman handbooks have to say about rhetorical structure? And the peroratio is the ending, the conclusion. And what are the characteristics of a conclusion in that sense? And how do they match up? Does chapter 12 match up more like that, or does chapter 13? And if not, what is chapter 13 trying to do? So in order to prove this proposition conclusively, it first must be shown the characteristics of the Greco-Roman rhetorical category called peroratio. The rhetorical handbooks from the first century and earlier provide great insights into the orator's education and offer general guidelines for the construction of a speech. By far the most influential and extant handbooks are the ones penned by Cicero, Aristotle, and Quintilian. Here we find the most enduring maps for the rhetorical education of the Roman student. Although the general outlook of all three rhetors is similar, it is instructive to see how each one assesses the task of the peroratio. So what we're going to see here is that each of them have their own particular things. Aristotle has these particular things he wants to say, Quintilian has these, and Cicero has these. But they all come together, no matter which way you look at it, the facets of a diamond, if you will. Each way you look at it, you're going to see that I'm arguing in chapter 12 and not in chapter 13. So a word of caution here is necessary, though. If left unchecked, the criteria of rhetorical handbooks may lead to the incorrect assumption that every category is set in stone and can never be moved or altered. The book of Hebrews cannot be forced into a stiff rhetorical formula without doing damage to its delicate nuances. The assumption that every triviality in a section must be followed as a formula misses the point of the handbooks. David Ayen writes of this rhetorical license. He says, quote, Aristotle did not inductively analyze actual speeches, but rather prescribed how ideal speeches ought to be constructed. Actual speeches could be more complex and eclectic. With this in mind, the guidelines of the handbooks offer a base, basically a foundation upon which the skilled rhetor he's never going to be in opposition to that, but he can move off of that as he sees fit. So let's look at Aristotle, Quintilian, and Cicero and see what they have to say about the peroratio. So Aristotle's examination of the peroratio consists principally with a division into four parts. First is to dispose the hearer favorably towards oneself and unfavorably towards the adversary, to amplify and deprecate, to excite the emotions of the hearer, and to recapitulate. Those are his four. An oration of any kind contains the main sections of well, I'll just go through them. The exordium, which is the introduction. The narratio, which is the nature of the disputed matter. The partitio, essential propositions. Probatio, explanation of the arguments. Refutatio, the refutations of arguments against it. And the peroratio. So that's what it looks like when they were teaching in the handbooks. The peroratio is a concluding summation of an oration, sermon, or speech. In the peroratio, there should be no introduction of new material. This is very important. There's no introduction of new material in the peroratio, but rather serves as a way to remind the listener of the points proven earlier. The speaker will use his final words in a precise and distilled fashion, making the contrast between the good and bad decision as clear as possible. Amplification is often used here as it builds up the force of the idea being argued for the final climax. According to Aristotle, the speaker should arouse the hearer to certain emotions, pity or indignation or hate, etc., in order to solidify the intellectual logos with the emotive pathos. Finally, the peroratio should be used to drive home the main point of the discussion. And this is a quote from him. I have spoken, you have heard, you know the facts, now make a decision. Okay? So that's very important for us as we look at chapter 12. Okay, so that's Aristotle. Cicero. Cicero speaks in depth on the peroratio in only two of his works, in De Inventione and Rhetorica ad Herennium. Now I know Rhetorica ad Herennium is probably authored by somebody else, a guy named Cornificius, but he basically, it's a good summation of what Cicero taught. George Kennedy, if anybody cares about that, George Kennedy writes about that a good bit. Cicero draws upon the work of Aristotle and defines the peroratio in three parts. The summing up, the indignatio, or exciting ill will towards your opponent, and the conquestio, the arousing of pity or sympathy. Cicero is helpful in illuminating strategies where the recapitulation can take place. In some rhetorical situations, actually forget that, I was supposed to take that out. Cicero splits the examination of pathos into two sections. This represents a development from previous rhetoric that in the arousal of ill will and sympathy are treated in detail and separately. The indignatio is employed to stir up hatred or offense at the opposing view, and we're going to see that in the two mountains between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion, the arousing of ill will towards the opponent and of sympathy towards Mount Zion. Cicero lists 15 topics through which an audience of deliberators may see the repugnance of the opposing view. These topics range from the anger of the gods to shame of the offending party. By the same method, the conquestio has several available arguments for sympathy, or what's called commonplaces, which bolster the resolve of the audience to act in favor of the idea in question. And finally, most importantly for our purposes, both volumes stress that the peroratio must be brief. And he says, for nothing dries as quickly as a tear. So you don't ever want to have a peroratio that lasts for very long, because if you arouse the emotions in people, they're very much with you. But once you get to the end of that, or if you try and take that too far, they'll turn on you. Okay, so that's Cicero. Finally, Quintilian. Quintilian, who is in AD 40 to 95, as the latest and most comprehensive writer on oratory, compiles and organizes the salient thoughts of all the writers before him. He's a fitting scholar with which to end our survey on peroratio. Quintilian's definition contains some of the same content of the others, but he chooses to distinguish between the two types of peroratio. He says there's recapitulation of proofs and also the appeal to pity. Quintilian makes this distinction because of the nature of the forensic rhetoric that he's discussing. It's not that they're two different things, but that one is more important than the other, and that you argue first and then you arouse the emotion. Now, what's striking about this treatise on rhetorical conclusions is the discussion of properly used emotive power and the device of amplification. And this is very important. This is an extended quote from him. But it is in the peroration, if anywhere, that we must let loose the whole torrent of our eloquence. Since the chief task of the peroration consists in amplification, we may legitimately make free use of words and reflections that are magnificent and ornate. It is at the close of our drama that we really must stir the theater. So that's another thing, what we're going to see, is the use of emotion. And does chapter 13, does it arouse the emotions of the hearer, or does chapter 12? For the readers of Quintilian's day, the peroratio was the climax of the emotional freight. The audience is reminded of the logical arguments, but the pathos thrusts the weight of the decision on the hearers. How will they decide now that they have been stirred in both mind and soul? This is where the oration ends, without détente, in order that the pressure of the decision, in order for that not to be escaped. So if you have too much of a downward slope, you will lose the pressure of the decision of what the author is trying to say. So we may conclude by formulating a kind of synthesis. So this is all of this. So we may conclude by formulating a kind of synthesis of peroratio concepts, and we gain a unique perspective on the whole. From Aristotle, the framework of the peroratio may be surmised, so the recapitulation of main points, the use of emotions, arousing sympathy for the positive and the negative idea. And Cicero would mention the importance of brevity in such a thing. He also splits it into indignatio and conquestio. And then from finally Quintilian, we take the intensity of the emotional focus of the peroratio and the use of things like comparison and accumulation in order to amplify the positivity or negativity of the idea. Okay, so we have here basically out of all of those handbooks, we've kind of aggregated them together, and this is what the Greco-Roman way of doing a conclusion would be. So what does that mean for us? So does chapter 12 line up with that, 18 through 29, or does chapter 13? So that's this next section. Okay. So the book of Hebrews contains within it some of the most tightly reasoned and complex argumentation of the entire New Testament. There are sections of expository material which rival Paul at his best in explanatory power. The depth of exegesis of Old Testament passages, recognition of typological threads, and unveiling of Jesus as high priest all serve to place the letter centrally in New Testament thought. Indeed, the book of Hebrews, in the book of Hebrews, the Christian community was given a bedrock foundation of hermeneutics for how they can understand the Old Testament in light of the New Testament. Yet for all of this, the expository sections of Hebrews are not the thing that's most important. In fact, the purpose of the book is remarkably simple. The writer labels his own work as a toulagu tes paraklesios, a word of exhortation. The author is single-minded in his focus throughout the sermon, always returning to the same exhortation. Don't fall away. Remain in Christ. Persevere in trial. Albert Van Hoy's groundbreaking work in the structure of Hebrews outlines parenetic sections at several points. I'm not going to go through all of them. But in each of these sections, the exhortation to not abandon the faith and to persevere in trial is clear. Little else is required of the recipients. So when this laser-like focus of the sermon is highlighted, the simplicity of the peroratio becomes apparent. At no point does the author want to distract the audience from the climactic decision that has to be made. The two sections of the peroratio in 18 and 24 and 25 and 29 encapsulate the doctrinal and parenetic quality of the entire book. Verse 25 urges, "See that you do not refuse him who is speaking." Verse 28 appeals again, "Let us be grateful. Let us offer to God acceptable worship." 11 chapters have been devoted to the advancement of this argument. There are no more considerations to be made. As Aristotle has said, "I have spoken, you have heard, you know the facts, now give your decision." The section at 18 and 29 is equally as succinct in summarizing the doctrinal portions of the sermon. I'm going to skip some of this. So basically, there are only two mountains that the audience may choose from. One of darkness, full of shadow, full of fear, and the other one, angels in festal gathering, the beauty of Mount Zion. They've already chosen the jewel of Mount Zion. They cannot return back to Mount Sinai. So how does chapter 13 measure up in this category? We see that chapter 12 is very much could be categorized this way. Instead of a recapitulation of the previous oration, new material is added to be remembered. So remember how it was, there should be no new material. It's all recapitulating what was already said and give your decision. There are no fewer than 18 new commands given from 1 to 19. This presents the opposite of what a conclusion or a peroratio is designed to do. Quintilian speaks concisely here. Quote, "This final recapitulation must be as brief as possible, and we must summarize the facts under the appropriate heads. Introduction of new material which is unrelated to the central appeal would serve to dampen the force of the conclusion." So in this first point, we can see absolutely chapter 13 doesn't really match up there. Chapter 12 does. Okay, so the second one, use of emotion. The second characteristic set by the rhetorical handbooks is a strong use of pathos. Stirring the emotions disposes the soul towards the argument at hand as well as the mind. The writer masterfully attains this climax by amplification. Amplification builds the character of the idea in question by the use of devices, figures of thought, accumulation, comparison, and cataclysmic eschatology. In the first case, distinctive and raw language is used in chapter 12 to conjure up fear and hope simultaneously in the hearers. This is a figure of thought known as vivid illustration. Quintilian writes of vivid illustration as any representation of facts which is made in such vivid language that they appeal to the eye rather than to the ear. So this is all the discussion of the two mountains. The consuming fire at the very end, at verse 28, would have been understood by a Jewish audience as referring to Deuteronomy 4:22 and the prohibition in God's covenant against idolatry. In fact, the same phrasing is used by the Septuagintal translator of Deuteronomy. The appeal to the renewal of the covenant and the curses that come along with the disobedience was the most forceful warning that could have been given to a group of Jewish people. Abandoning Christianity is tantamount to a betrayal of God who has made promises to his people. Another case of evocative language is in the mountains comparison of 18 through 24. The writer deliberately uses frightening imagery to remind the audience that returning to the ways of Mount Sinai is foolhardy. He uses vocabulary like the blazing fire and the tempest and darkness and gloom, and they're strung together, filling the imagination and reminding them from where they came. Kai, the and, is used as a connective conjunction 5 times in those 2 verses. So he uses them over and over and over again. This is accumulation, bringing them over and over again. And they create a crescendo of emotion that Quintilian calls accumulation. Let's see. The vocabulary brings fervor and longing with it, and this is intentional. Indeed, even the comparison between the 2 mountains at all presents an important example of application. The 2 mountains are presented before the hearers as a pure foil. The contrast is simple and striking. Obviously, the hearers would not want to return to the fear and darkness and gloom of Mount Sinai, especially when the light and love and festivity of Christ is open to them. Let's move on a little bit. Chapter 12 clearly activates the emotional reserves of everyone who will listen. But is chapter 13 a better example of emotional climax? Whereas 12 uses the devices of amplification to build up the hearer's feelings, there's very little of this in 13. Even scholars who argue for the continuity of chapter 13 recognize this disparity. R.V.G. Tasker's comments that the reader naturally feels a shock when transitioning abruptly from 1 to 12 to 13. He even calls the final chapter inconsequential in light of the weight of previous texts, though I wouldn't agree with that. Harold Attridge admits that there is a conclusion at the end of 12:29, but this is only a conclusion of the warning section. Is this really the best explanation? If chapter 13 is taken as a peroratio unto itself, it falls horribly flat. There is no whole torrent of emotion released, but rather a slow ebb, even with the discussion of going to Jesus outside of the camp notwithstanding. Though memorable, 10 to 14 cannot be construed to bring along the book of Hebrews to an emotional climax. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3, arousal of sympathy and disgust. There's not as big of a need for discussion here because there's a lot of points in the emotional part that overlap. But it's worthwhile talking about the topics as well as the brevity. As mentioned above, Cicero recounts in great detail the 14 topics that may be used in the arousal of disgust for the negative alternatives to the decision in question. This is not to say that other arguments may not be used, only that they have not been deemed effective for this particular part. The first topic named, and seemingly the most effective, is an appeal to the gods, to the immortal gods. Casting the argument in terms of deities with care and attention that they have shown to the event or idea can be convincing to an audience. If the gods are in opposition, it's not good to be on the other side. So if God is found to be on the side of Mount Zion, it makes sense not to be on the side of Mount Sinai. In every chapter, there is the struggle to connect the work of Jesus with the will of God, making clear whose side he is on. In chapter 12, the reason the comparison between the two mountains is so effective is that it places the audience at the same mountain as the revealed Lord. Mount Zion is shown clearly as the place where God's blessings and grace abide. And if so, the return to Mount Sinai is to place oneself in opposition to God Almighty. The other topic with which to arouse disgust is the 11th. In this situation, it's argued that the person considering the negative view ought to never do so. In fact, the person or people ought to be the ones championing the other side. The character of those making the decision should make it easy for them to decide. The fact that they waver is a shame to them. Again, this topic is not exclusive to 12, but is used in chapters 5 and 6 also. The hearers ought to be teachers by now, but still live on milk and cannot discern good from evil. In chapter 12, it is made clear that they have come to Mount Sinai as part of the people of God, sharing in the blessings of the covenant, but now they are considering rejecting him who warns from heaven, and to do so would result in their eternal shame and judgment. Now, chapter 13 has a noticeable lack of these characteristics, as is evident in point 3. The effort to arouse disgust or the alternatives to remaining in Christ is scattered at best. If anything, the discussion in 10 to 14 would mirror some of the conquestio's characteristics, not the indignatio. Also, couching these characteristics within bare imperatives leave any emotive power to lay flat. So, yet again, chapter 13 doesn't seem to fit the bill. Okay, finally, brevity. The final distinctive characteristic of the peroratio is found in its concise nature. The readers make much of the fact that the peroratio loses its power when carried too long. Quote, this is from Quintilian. Appeals to pity should, however, always be brief, and there is good reason for saying that nothing dries so quickly as tears. We must not, therefore, allow the effect which we have produced to fall flat, and must consequently abandon our appeal to the emotion just when that emotion is at its height. The peroratio is not a second oration. The audience quickly becomes fatigued by an appeal to emotion, and therefore must be given a succinct end. This understanding should not be underestimated, as the success of a speech may stand or fall by the final note that reverberates in the mind of the hearers. If the conclusion drags along without a concise close, the force of the speech may be ruined. The peroratio of chapter 12, however, only lasts for 11 verses. For such a small length of time, there is a remarkable amount of recapitulation, the use of emotion, and arousal of pity. But after the point is made, and at the height of its rhetorical power, the appeal is sounded for a reverent and worship and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. No further comment is needed. No further appeal is made. Chapter 13 far outpaces the ending of chapter 12 in length. The peroratio of chapter 12 is only 11 verses, while 13 is over double the amount. Though there is no set amount of time laid out for a conclusion, chapter 13 holds no sense of urgency to bind together and cut off what is indicative of the peroratio. On the contrary, 13 reads like an addendum of a concerned pastor, reminding his flock of their daily duties. General pastoral commands like, "Let brotherly love continue," and "Obey your leaders and submit to them," do not pulse with the urgency of decision. One gets the sense that there is far too much time for the tear to dry. So, we've gone through all of this and matched up one with the other. Chapter 12 seems to be much more a part of this than of 13. Now, I can go through different objections that people have to them, but I would like to ask, what sort of thoughts do you have as I read some of these things? Does it make sense? Does it concern you? Is it boring? I don't know. Any questions?